There is a 17-year-old boy standing in a crater in the 8th episode of the first season of Invincible, aired on April 30th, 2021. And the man who put him there is his father. The crater is in Chicago. The boy is bleeding from his mouth, from his eyes, from places inside him that will heal because his body is built to heal. Because his body is half Viltrumite, because his body was designed by evolution and empire to survive exactly this kind of damage. But the look on his face is not the look of a body that is healing. It is the look of a mind that is breaking. His father is standing over him, fist raised, and the boy is not thinking about survival. He is thinking about the baseball games, the dinners, the morning his father taught him to shave. The show holds on this face for 3 seconds. 3 seconds of a boy realizing that the man he modeled his entire identity on has been lying to him since before he was born. 3 seconds of the foundational architecture of a human psyche collapsing in real time. A psychologist would have a lot to say about those 3 seconds. Tonight, we are going to listen. Before we go any further, if you enjoy long-form essays like this, subscribing genuinely helps us keep making them. It is free, and it takes a few seconds. Now back to it. If you were to sit Mark Grayson down in a therapist's office, which the show never does because the show understands that Mark would never voluntarily sit in a therapist's office, the first thing a clinician would notice is not the superpowers. The first thing they would notice is the hypervigilance, the way Mark scans every room he enters, the way his body tenses at unexpected sounds, the way he positions himself even in casual social settings, with his back to the wall and his eyes on the door, the way soldiers do, the way abused survivors do, the way anyone does whose nervous system has been reprogrammed by repeated exposure to life-threatening violence to treat every environment as a potential combat zone. This is not heroism. This is symptomatology. And the distinction matters because the show, across 4 seasons, presents Mark's psychological deterioration with a clinical accuracy that suggests someone in the writing room has either studied trauma or lived it. The symptoms are specific. They are progressive. They follow the trajectory that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, describes for complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And they do so with a fidelity that makes Mark Grayson one of the most psychologically authentic characters in the superhero genre. Complex PTSD, sometimes abbreviated as CPTSD, is distinguished from standard PTSD by its origin in prolonged repeated trauma, particularly trauma that occurs within relationships where the victim cannot escape. Standard PTSD can result from a single catastrophic event, a car accident, a natural disaster, a single instance of violence. Complex PTSD results from ongoing exposure to threat within a relational context, from the kind of trauma that rewires not just the fear response, but the entire architecture of the self. The way a person understands who they are, how they relate to others, whether the world is safe, whether people can be trusted, whether love is real or just another word for a trap that has not yet been sprung. Mark Grayson meets the criteria, not because he was punched through a building, not because his body has been broken and rebuilt more times than the show can count. He meets the criteria because the source of his deepest trauma is not an enemy, it is a parent. The person who was supposed to be the safest presence in his life, the person whose approval he sought, whose example he followed, whose love he never questioned, turned out to be the most dangerous being he has ever encountered. And the betrayal did not happen once, it happened retroactively, reaching backward through 17 years of memories and contaminating every single one of them. A psychologist looking at Mark's case would begin with the attachment system, because the attachment system is where everything starts and where everything in Mark's case first breaks. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby in the mid-20th century and expanded by Mary Ainsworth's research in the 1970s, describes the bond between a child and their primary caregiver as the template for all subsequent relationships. A child who experiences their caregiver as reliable, responsive, and safe develops what is called secure attachment. A baseline confidence that the world is navigable, that other people can be trusted, that the self is worthy of care. Mark had secure attachment. For 17 years he had it. Nolan was present. Nolan was by all observable measures a good father. He played catch, he helped with homework, he modeled the kind of quiet competence that sons internalize and carry forward into their own adult lives. The attachment Mark formed with Nolan was deep and genuine, built on thousands of interactions that communicated safety, that communicated belonging, that communicated the most fundamental message a parent can give a child. You are mine, and I will protect you. And then the attachment was destroyed, not gradually, not through the kind of slow deterioration that characterizes most family breakdowns, where the signs accumulate over months and years, and the child has time to adjust, to develop coping mechanisms, to prepare psychologically for the separation. Mark's attachment was destroyed in a single evening, in a single conversation, in the specific moment when Nolan looked at his son and told him the truth about why he came to Earth. The secure base that Mark had built his entire identity on was revealed to be a forward operating base for an alien invasion, and the protector turned out to be the threat, and the love turned out to be, in Nolan's own devastating word, the affection a person might feel for a pet. What happens to the human psyche when secure attachment is retroactively destroyed? The clinical literature calls it betrayal trauma, a term coined by Jennifer Fried in 1994 to describe the specific damage that occurs when the source of trauma is someone the victim depends on for survival. Betrayal trauma is different from other forms of trauma because the victim's attachment system, the very system designed to seek safety from caregivers, is in direct conflict with their threat detection system, the system designed to identify and flee from danger. The caregiver is simultaneously the source of safety and the source of threat. The two systems cannot reconcile. The mind, forced to hold contradictory truths simultaneously, begins to fragment. The fight itself, the physical confrontation between Mark and Nolan that occupies the climax of Season 1, is one of the most psychologically significant sequences in the entire series, and a trauma specialist would want to examine it in detail because the way it unfolds maps directly onto patterns that appear in the literature on child abuse, particularly the literature on abuse by a parent who is also, in other contexts, loving. The fight begins with Nolan asking Mark to join him. This is important. The violence does not start immediately. It starts with an invitation, with Nolan offering Mark the opportunity to accept the Viltrumite mission and take his place beside his father in the conquest of Earth. The invitation is, in its own twisted way, an expression of love. Nolan is asking Mark to be part of his world, to share his purpose, to join him in the thing that gives his life meaning. He is asking the way a father might ask a son to join the family business, except the family business is the subjugation of a species, and the refusal is not met with disappointment but with violence. Mark refuses, and when he refuses, the father he loved becomes the thing that will hurt him. The transition is instantaneous. There is no warning, there is no escalation. One moment Nolan is asking, and the next moment Nolan is hitting, and the speed of the transition, the absence of the gradual buildup that would allow a person to prepare psychologically for the shift from safety to danger, is itself a form of trauma. The nervous system is designed to handle gradual changes in threat level. It can adjust, it can recalibrate, it can shift from rest to readiness in a smooth curve that allows the conscious mind to track what is happening and respond appropriately. What it cannot handle is the instantaneous reversal of categories. The moment when the safe person becomes the dangerous person. The moment when the category labeled father is suddenly also labeled threat. Mark's nervous system in the moment of that first punch performs a recategorization that it will spend the rest of the series trying to undo. It moves Nolan from the safe column to the dangerous column. And because the attachment system generalizes, because the brain's threat detection algorithms are designed to cast wide nets rather than precise ones, the recategorization does not stop at Nolan. It extends to the entire category that Nolan occupies. Authority figures, mentors, older men who offer guidance, people who are stronger than Mark, people who claim to love him. The brain, operating on the logic of survival rather than the logic of nuance, decides that anything that resembles the thing that hurt you is potentially the thing that will hurt you again. And the resemblance does not need to be precise. It needs to be possible. This is the mechanism that produces Mark's generalized mistrust, his difficulty with Cecil, his wariness around new authority figures, his tendency to test every relationship for signs of the betrayal that his nervous system is permanently expecting. The mechanism is not rational. Mark knows, consciously, that Cecil is not Nolan. He knows that his teachers are not Nolan. He knows that the people who care about him are not, with the exception of the one who was, planning to destroy him. But the mechanism does not operate at the level of conscious knowledge. It operates at the level of automatic response. And the automatic response was programmed in the crater in the 3 seconds where the world changed. And the program has been running ever since, scanning every face for the expression that preceded the first punch, listening to every voice for the tone that preceded the revelation, treating every moment of kindness as potential prelude to betrayal because the biggest kindness Mark ever received, 20 years of a loving father, turned out to be the biggest lie. The show captures the progression of the fight with a level of physical and psychological detail that deserves recognition. As the fight moves from the house to the sky to the city to the mountain, Mark's responses shift in ways that mirror the stages of acute trauma response. Initially, he fights back. He is angry, he is defiant, he is the son who will not accept his father's mission and who expresses that refusal through the only language the situation allows, the the language of fists. This is the fight response, the first stage of the threat cascade, the body's most energetic and most unsustainable reaction to danger. Then the fight response fails. Mark is outmatched. He knows he is outmatched. His father is stronger, faster, more experienced, more ruthless. Every blow Mark lands is absorbed. Every blow Nolan lands breaks something. The disparity in power is absolute, and the recognition of that disparity triggers the next stage of the cascade, the flight response, the desperate attempt to create distance between the self and the source of danger. Mark tries to run. He tries to fly away. He tries to put space between himself and the thing that is hurting him, but he cannot. The thing that is hurting him is faster than he is. The thing that is hurting him has been trained for thousands of years in the art of closing distance. The thing that is hurting him is his father. And you cannot outrun your father, not literally, not psychologically, not in any of the ways that matter. When flight fails, the cascade moves to its final stage. Freeze, collapse, surrender. Mark stops fighting, he stops running, he lies in the crater and he looks up at Nolan and he does not move. He has passed through the fight and flight responses and arrived at the place where the nervous system gives up, where the body, having exhausted its options for resistance and escape, simply stops. This is the state that trauma researchers call tonic immobility, and it is the state in which the deepest psychological damage occurs, because the self, in the moment of surrender, registers not just fear, but helplessness. Not just pain, but the complete absence of agency. The understanding that nothing you do will change the outcome, that you are entirely at the mercy of the thing that is hurting you. 3 seconds. The fist is raised, the boy does not move, and in those 3 seconds, the self that existed before, the self that was confident and trusting and certain of its place in the world, is replaced by a self that knows something it cannot unlearn. It knows what it feels like to be completely powerless in the presence of the person you love most. It knows what it looks like when love becomes violence. It knows what the transition sounds like, the exact quality of silence that exists between the last word of the invitation and the first impact of the fist. This knowledge does not fade. It does not diminish with time. It sits in the nervous system like a loaded weapon, and every subsequent experience that resembles it, even distantly, even in ways that the conscious mind knows are not genuinely threatening, triggers the same cascade, the same fight-flight-freeze sequence, the same 3 seconds of recognition that the person you trusted is the person who can destroy you. Mark shows the signs of this fragmentation from the first episode of Season 2 onward. He is irritable, he is withdrawn, he oscillates between periods of intense activity, throwing himself into superhero work with a recklessness that borders on self-destruction, and periods of paralysis, where he cannot make decisions, cannot engage with the people around him, cannot access the emotional resources that would allow him to process what has happened. He is, in clinical terms, dysregulated. His emotional thermostat has been broken, and the mechanisms that would normally allow him to modulate between states of arousal and rest, between engagement and withdrawal, between fight and recovery, are no longer functioning correctly. A therapist observing Mark in Season 2 would likely note the presence of several specific symptoms. The first is emotional numbing, the inability to access feelings that should be present. Mark talks about his father's betrayal in flat, detached terms, as though he is describing something that happened to someone else. He uses intellectualization as a defense mechanism, converting emotional pain into abstract analysis, talking about the strategic implications of his father's departure rather than the personal devastation of it. This is not stoicism. This is dissociation, a psychological process in which the mind disconnects from experiences that are too overwhelming to process in real time, filing them away in a compartment that can be opened later, or never. The second symptom is what clinicians call re-experiencing, the intrusive return of traumatic memories in the form of flashbacks, nightmares, or sudden emotional flooding triggered by stimuli that resemble elements of the original trauma. Mark experiences this throughout the series, a sound that resembles his father's voice, a news report about Viltrumite activity, the specific quality of light during a sunset that mirrors the light on the evening his father nearly killed him. These triggers arrive without warning and without permission, hijacking Mark's attention and pulling him back into the crater, back into the moment of breaking, back into the 3 seconds that changed everything. The show dramatizes re-experiencing with a visual sophistication that rewards psychological literacy. When Mark is triggered, the animation shifts, the colors desaturate, the frame tightens, the sound design changes, introducing a low-frequency hum that mimics the physiological experience of a triggered nervous system. The rush of blood, the acceleration of heartbeat, the narrowing of perception that occurs when the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, activates and floods the body with cortisol and adrenaline. The audience does not just see Mark's flashbacks, they feel them. because the show's formal choices replicate the sensory experience of being pulled out of the present and into the past. The third symptom, and perhaps the most clinically significant, is hypervigilance. Mark cannot relax. He cannot lower his guard. He cannot sit in a room without cataloging the exits, assessing the potential threats, calculating the response time between the first sign of danger and the moment he would need to act. This is not the professional alertness of a trained hero. This is the autonomic anxiety of a person whose nervous system has learned through direct and repeated experience that safety is an illusion and that the next attack can come from anywhere, including from the people you love most. Hypervigilance is exhausting. It is one of the least visible symptoms of PTSD and one of the most debilitating, because it operates continuously, burning through the body's energy reserves even during periods of apparent calm. A hypervigilant person is never resting, even when they appear to be resting. Their system is always running, always scanning, always preparing for a threat that may or may not materialize. The metabolic cost of this constant readiness is enormous, and it explains something about Mark that the show depicts without always explaining. His fatigue, his short temper, his difficulty concentrating on conversations that have nothing to do with danger, his tendency to fall asleep in class and at dinner and during quiet moments that should be restful, but that his body experiences as vulnerabilities, as gaps in his defensive perimeter that an attacker could exploit. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that the show captures in Mark that goes beyond the physical tiredness of fighting. It is the exhaustion of a person who is performing normalcy while managing an internal landscape of catastrophe. Mark goes to class, he talks to his friends, he eats lunch in the cafeteria and pretends to care about assignments and tries to laugh at jokes that his mind, running its parallel processing of threat assessment, barely registers. He does all the things that a normal college-age person does, and he does them while simultaneously carrying the weight of a psychological burden that would hospitalize most adults. This performance is itself a source of depletion. In psychology, the concept is sometimes called surface acting, borrowed from the sociologist Arlie Hochschild's work on emotional labor. Surface acting occurs when a person displays emotions they do not feel, when the face does not match the interior, when the performance of normalcy is maintained through conscious effort rather than genuine experience. Studies on surface acting consistently show that it is one of the most draining forms of emotional work a person can engage in, because it requires the constant expenditure of cognitive resources to monitor the gap between what you feel and what you show, to catch the moments where the mask slips, to adjust the performance in real time based on the reactions of the people around you. Mark surface acts constantly. He smiles when he does not feel like smiling. He engages in conversations that his traumatized mind cannot fully track. He pretends that the bruises, when they are visible, are from something mundane. He pretends that his absences have ordinary explanations. He pretends that the look in his eyes, the look that William sometimes catches and does not comment on, the look that flickers across his face when a loud noise triggers a flash of something too fast to name, is nothing. Just tired, just distracted, just a college kid with a lot on his plate. The people around Mark accept this performance because the alternative, recognizing what is actually happening, would require them to enter a world they are not equipped to navigate. William, Mark's closest friend and roommate, occupies a fascinating psychological position in the show. He knows about Mark's powers, he has seen what Mark does, he has been exposed to the reality that Mark inhabits. But knowing and understanding are not the same thing, and William's knowledge of Mark's world does not translate into comprehension of Mark's psychological state. William sees the fights. He does not see the flashbacks, he sees the injuries. He does not see the nightmares. He sees the hero. He does not see the boy in the crater who has not yet been healed. This is the isolation that trauma creates even in the presence of friendship. Mark is not alone. He has people who love him, people who would do anything for him, people who have demonstrated their loyalty through actions that go far beyond what friendship typically requires. But he is psychologically alone in a way that his friends cannot bridge, because the bridge would require them to fully enter his interior experience, and his interior experience is a war zone that no visitor pass can grant access to. A clinician would note that Mark's social functioning, while superficially intact, shows the hallmarks of what is called pseudo-mutuality, a term from family systems theory that describes relationships that appear healthy on the surface, but that lack genuine emotional depth beneath the performance. Mark's friendships are real. His love for the people in his life is genuine, but the depth of connection that those relationships could achieve is limited by the depth of access Mark allows, and the depth of access Mark allows is limited by the depth of his fear, which is bottomless. Because the last time he opened the full depth of himself to someone, that someone was his father, and his father used the access to destroy him. The body keeps the score. That phrase, borrowed from the title of Bessel van der Kolk's landmark 2014 book on trauma, and the body describes a principle that is central to understanding Mark's psychological profile. Trauma is not stored only in the mind. It is stored in the body, in the muscle memory, in the reflexes, in the autonomic responses that fire before conscious thought can intervene. Mark's body has been keeping score since the crater. It has been recording every hit, every near-death experience, every moment of helplessness, every instance where his Viltrumite healing closed the physical wound while the psychological wound remained open and bleeding. The score is long. By season 4, the tally of traumatic exposures that Mark's body has recorded includes the near-fatal beating by his father, the fights with the Mahler twins, the battle with Angstrom Levy across multiple dimensions, the Sequid invasion, the encounter with Conquest, the Viltrumite War, the Invincible War where he fought alternate evil versions of himself, and dozens of smaller encounters that individually might be manageable but that collectively form a pattern of unrelenting violence that would overwhelm any psychological system, human or Viltrumite. Each of these events added a layer to the body's scorecard. Each one recalibrated the nervous system's baseline anxiety upward. Each one reinforced the lesson that the body learned in the crater. The lesson that the world is dangerous, and that the danger can come from anywhere, and that the only appropriate response is constant, unrelenting vigilance. The body does not care that Mark has Viltrumite healing. The body's trauma response does not distinguish between wounds that heal quickly and wounds that heal slowly. It responds to the threat, not the outcome. It records the fear, not the recovery. And the accumulation of fear, deposited layer after layer like geological strata, forms the bedrock of Mark's psychological landscape, a landscape that is stable on the surface and fractured underneath. Van der Kolk's research suggests that the body's trauma storage manifests in specific physical patterns: chronic tension in the muscles, disturbances in sleep architecture, alterations in the startle response, changes in posture and gait that reflect the body's unconscious preparation for threat. The show depicts many of these patterns in Mark, though it does not label them. The tension in Mark's shoulders when he is in civilian mode, the way he flinches at unexpected physical contact, even friendly contact, even the touch of a hand on his arm that any non-traumatized person would register as comfort, the restlessness that prevents him from sitting still for extended periods, the body's way of maintaining readiness, of keeping the muscles primed for the explosive movement that combat requires. These are not character traits, they are symptoms. And the show's decision to depict them consistently, across seasons without ever explicitly identifying them as symptoms, is one of its most sophisticated psychological choices. The audience absorbs Mark's trauma responses as part of who he is rather than as evidence of what was done to him. They normalize the symptoms because the show normalizes them, because Mark normalizes them, because normalizing them is itself a coping mechanism, a way of converting pathology into personality, so that the pathology becomes bearable. The show's treatment of Mark's sleep is another area where clinical accuracy meets narrative sophistication. Sleep disturbance is one of the most reliable indicators of PTSD, and it is one of the symptoms that most significantly impacts overall functioning. Because sleep is not a luxury. Sleep is the time during which the brain processes emotional experiences, consolidates memories, and performs the housekeeping functions that allow the nervous system to operate at baseline levels during waking hours. When sleep is disrupted, these functions are impaired, and the impairment cascades through every other area of functioning: cognitive performance, emotional regulation, immune function, the ability to form and maintain relationships, the capacity for pleasure, the tolerance for stress. Mark does not sleep well. The show communicates this through visual cues rather than exposition, through the shadows under his eyes, through the scenes where he is awake at hours that suggest either very early rising or very late sleeping, through the moments where his attention drifts in mid-conversation in the way that attention drifts when the brain is operating on insufficient rest. These are not dramatic moments. They are not accompanied by montages of nightmare sequences or sweating bolt upright in bed cliches. They are small, realistic depictions of what chronic sleep disturbance actually looks like, which is not cinematic insomnia but a persistent, low-grade exhaustion that becomes the new normal. A background condition that the person stops noticing because noticing it would require acknowledging that something is wrong. And acknowledging that something is wrong would require doing something about it. And doing something about it would require stopping. And stopping is the one thing Mark cannot do. The nightmares, when the show does depict them, are not the fantastical dreamscapes of lesser fiction. They are replays. They are the same fight, the same crater, the same 3 seconds, but distorted in the way that traumatic memories are distorted when they surface during sleep. Compressed and exaggerated and reorganized according to the logic of fear rather than the logic of narrative. In Mark's nightmares, Nolan does not stop. In Mark's nightmares, the 3 seconds do not end with Nolan pulling back and crying and flying away. They end with the fist descending. They end with the outcome that Mark's nervous system expected, and that reality, by a margin that feels impossibly narrow, did not deliver. The clinical term for this is threat rehearsal, and it is one of the proposed evolutionary functions of PTSD nightmares. The theory, developed by Antti Revonsuo in the early 2000s, suggests that the dreaming brain rehearses threatening scenarios in order to prepare the organism for future encounters with similar threats. The nightmares are not malfunctions. They are the brain's attempt to solve a problem, the problem of how to survive the next time the thing that almost killed you tries again. The brain does not know that the specific threat has passed. The brain does not distinguish between past and potential future. It processes the threat as ongoing, as unresolved, as a situation that requires continued preparation. And the nightmares are the preparation. The nightly dress rehearsal for a performance that may never come, but that the brain, operating on the principle that preparation is survival, refuses to stop practicing for. Mark wakes from these nightmares and goes to class. He wakes from these nightmares and answers the phone. He wakes from these nightmares and puts on the costume and flies into the next fight, with a body that did not rest and a mind that spent the night rehearsing its own destruction. The cumulative effect of this pattern, repeated night after night across 4 seasons, is a progressive degradation of the cognitive and emotional resources that Mark needs to function. A slow drawdown on a battery that is never fully recharged. A depletion that manifests not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual dimming, a fading of the light behind the eyes. A growing distance between the person Mark appears to be and the person Mark can actually feel himself being. The audience watches this dimming across the series, and if they are paying attention, they notice that the Mark of Season 4 is not the Mark of Season 1. Not just because he has experienced more, though he has. Not just because he has fought more, though he has. Because the quality of his presence has changed. The brightness that characterized the early Mark, the eagerness and the optimism and the genuine pleasure in discovering his powers and using them to help people, has been replaced by something more muted, more guarded, more carefully managed. The smile is still there, but it arrives later and departs sooner. The jokes are still there, but they carry a weight that the early jokes did not. The heroism is still there, but it is performed with a heaviness that suggests obligation rather than joy, duty rather than calling, the grinding continuation of a commitment that has long since stopped being fun and has become, instead, a form of penance. The show understands that Mark's body is invulnerable, but his mind is not. And this is the central psychological paradox of his character, the thing that a psychologist would find most fascinating and most concerning about his case. Mark can survive a punch that would destroy a mountain. He can take a beating that would kill any human being on the planet. His body regenerates. His bones knit. His skin closes over wounds that would be fatal to anyone without Viltrumite DNA. He is, in the physical sense, nearly indestructible. But trauma does not live in the body. Trauma lives in the mind. And the mind does not regenerate. The mind does not knit broken things back together automatically, without effort, without intervention. The mind requires processing. It requires time. It requires safety. It requires the specific conditions that allow a traumatized person to revisit their experiences at a manageable pace, to integrate the fragmented memories into a coherent narrative, to update the threat detection system with information that distinguishes the past from the present. Mark's mind has none of these conditions. He lives in a state of continuous threat. He is never safe because the world he inhabits is genuinely dangerous, and the danger is not imagined or exaggerated or the product of a dysregulated nervous system. The danger is real. And the fact that the danger is real makes his PTSD essentially untreatable by conventional means, because conventional treatment assumes that the threat has passed and the patient can begin the work of recovery in an environment of relative safety. Mark does not have that environment. He may never have it. This is where the show's psychological portrait becomes genuinely tragic, and it is where a psychologist would feel the most concern. Mark is trapped in a cycle that his circumstances will not allow him to exit. He experiences trauma, he develops symptoms, the symptoms impair his functioning, the impaired functioning makes him more vulnerable to future trauma. The future trauma produces more symptoms. The cycle feeds itself, and there is no point in the cycle where Mark can step off. Because stepping off would mean stopping, and stopping would mean vulnerability. And vulnerability in Mark's world does not mean discomfort. It means death. It means the death of the people he loves. It means the end of the world he is trying to protect. So he keeps going, he absorbs the damage, and he keeps going. He pushes through the flashbacks and the nightmares and the hypervigilance and the emotional numbing and the dissociation and the mounting psychological burden that no amount of Viltrumite healing can address. And he does it because the alternative, stopping, is worse than the damage. This is not resilience, though the show occasionally frames it that way and Mark would certainly describe it that way if you asked him. This is survival behavior. It is the coping strategy of a person who has correctly identified that their environment is too dangerous to allow for the luxury of healing, and who has made the pragmatic, devastating, psychologically unsustainable decision to keep functioning at the cost of their own internal cohesion. A therapist would recognize this pattern. They would see it in veterans who cannot leave the military because civilian life feels more dangerous than combat. They would see it in first responders who take double shifts because being at the station feels safer than being at home with their thoughts. They would see it in survivors of domestic violence who remain in dangerous situations because the known danger feels more manageable than the unknown danger of leaving. The pattern has a name. It is called perpetual crisis mode, and it is characterized by the inability to downregulate from a state of threat readiness, the progressive erosion of emotional capacity, and the gradual replacement of genuine emotional experience with a functional numbness that allows the person to continue operating but does not allow them to actually live. Mark is operating. He is not living. And the distance between those two things grows wider with every season. There is a concept in trauma psychology called the window of tolerance, developed by Daniel Siegel, that provides a useful framework for understanding Mark's psychological trajectory across the series. The window of tolerance describes the zone of arousal within which a person can function effectively, processing emotions, engaging with the environment, making decisions, connecting with other people. When a person is within their window of tolerance, they are in a state that clinicians call optimal arousal, alert but not anxious, engaged but not overwhelmed, capable of handling the normal stresses of daily life without being pushed into either hyperarousal, the fight or flight state, or hypoarousal, the freeze or collapse state. Trauma narrows the window. Each traumatic experience reduces the zone of optimal functioning, making it easier for the person to be pushed out of the window and into one of the dysregulated states. A person with a wide window of tolerance can handle unexpected stressors, can absorb surprises, can navigate interpersonal conflict without being overwhelmed. A person with a narrow window of tolerance is operating on a razor's edge, and the smallest perturbation, a raised voice, an unexpected movement, a memory triggered by a smell or a sound, can push them out of functional engagement and into either panic or shutdown. Mark's window of tolerance has been narrowing since episode 1. Each season has compressed it further. By season 4, the window is so narrow that Mark oscillates between hyperarousal and hypoarousal, with very little time spent in the functional middle. He is either wired, scanning, fighting, preparing to fight, or he is flat, numb, disconnected, staring at walls with the blank expression of a person whose emotional processing system has temporarily gone offline to prevent overload. The audience sees both states. They see the wired Mark, the Mark who responds to threats with immediate and sometimes disproportionate force, the Mark whose body launches into action before his mind is finished evaluating whether action is necessary. And they see the flat Mark, the Mark who sits in his dorm room or on Eve's couch and stares at nothing and gives monosyllabic answers to questions, and cannot seem to locate the part of himself that cares about the things he used to care about. These two Marks are not different people. They are the same person oscillating between the only two states that his narrowed window of tolerance still allows. Siegel's research suggests that one of the primary goals of trauma therapy is to widen the window of tolerance, to gradually expand the zone of optimal functioning so that the person can spend more time in the regulated middle and less time at the extremes. The therapeutic tools for this work include grounding techniques, mindfulness practices, somatic experiencing, and the gradual, titrated exposure to traumatic material in a safe environment. These tools require time. They require safety. They require a therapeutic relationship built on trust. Mark has none of these things. His window continues to narrow, and the therapeutic intervention that could reverse the narrowing remains inaccessible because the world keeps pushing him out of the window before the window can expand. This is not the show being cruel to Mark. This is the show being honest about the conditions that most trauma survivors live in. Most people who need therapy cannot afford it, cannot access it, or cannot create the conditions of safety that effective therapy requires. Most people whose windows of tolerance have been narrowed by trauma do not have the luxury of stepping out of their stressful environments to do the work of recovery. They cope. They manage. They develop workarounds and survival strategies and ways of functioning within the narrow window that remain operational even when the window is so compressed that functionality becomes a technical achievement rather than a lived experience. They do what Mark does. They keep going, not because keeping going is healthy, because keeping going is the only option that does not result in something worse. The friendship between Mark and William Clockwell is worth examining in more clinical detail, because it represents one of the few genuinely therapeutic elements in Mark's life. even though neither Mark nor William would describe it that way. William is not a therapist. He is a college student with his own problems and his own perspective and his own limitations, but he provides something that the clinical literature on trauma recovery identifies as essential, and that something is witness. Witness, in the context of trauma psychology, refers to the presence of another person who acknowledges the reality of what the survivor has experienced. The witness does not need to understand every detail. They do not need to have shared the experience. They do not need to offer solutions or interpretations or the kind of therapeutic reframing that clinicians are trained to provide. They simply need to be there. They need to see the person. They need to communicate through their presence and their attention and their willingness to remain in the room that the survivor is not alone in their experience, that someone else knows, that the burden is not entirely invisible. William is Mark's witness. He knows about the powers. He knows in broad strokes about the cost. And while his knowledge is incomplete and his understanding is limited and his ability to help is constrained by the sheer scale of what Mark is dealing with, his presence matters. It matters because Mark has at least one person in his life to whom he does not have to fully perform normalcy. One person in whose presence the mask can slip slightly, one person who will not be frightened or confused or repelled by the glimpses of what lives behind it. The clinical research on social support and trauma recovery consistently shows that the single most protective factor against the development of chronic PTSD is the quality of the survivor's social connections in the aftermath of trauma, not the quantity. The quality, one genuinely supportive relationship provides more psychological protection than a dozen superficial ones, and the mechanism of that protection is not complex. It is simply the knowledge that someone sees you, that someone knows, that the isolation is not total. William provides this for Mark. Eve provides a different version of it, deeper and more comprehensive, but also more complicated, because Eve is both witness and participant, both the person who sees Mark's pain and the person who shares his world of danger, and the dual role creates a relationship dynamic that is supportive in some ways and reinforcing in others. A dynamic where the shared experience of trauma can create intimacy, but can also create a loop where each person's unprocessed material activates the other person's, and the relationship becomes a space of mutual triggering as well as mutual support. A psychologist would note that Mark's relationship with Eve has elements of what the literature calls trauma bonding, a connection forged in the shared experience of extreme circumstances. Trauma bonds are intense. They are genuine. They produce a feeling of closeness and understanding that ordinary shared experience cannot replicate, because the shared material is extraordinary, and the act of sharing it creates an intimacy that is both authentic and potentially problematic. The problem is not that the connection is false. The problem is that the connection is built on a foundation of shared pain, and when the pain is the basis of the bond can become dependent on the pain, and the prospect of healing can feel like a threat to the relationship rather than a benefit. Mark and Eve love each other. That is not in question. But a clinician would want to explore whether the love is structured in a way that supports Mark's healing or in a way that inadvertently maintains his pathology. Does the relationship give Mark space to be vulnerable, or does it give him another person to protect, another source of anxiety, another potential loss that his hypervigilant mind adds to the list of things it must guard against? Does Eve's understanding of Mark's world help him process it, or does it normalize it, making the abnormal feel routine and thereby reducing the motivation to seek the kind of help that could actually address the underlying damage? These are not questions with easy answers. They are the kind of questions that a good therapist would spend months exploring, carefully, gradually, with the patience that Mark's defensive structure would require. And they are questions that the show, to its credit, does not try to answer definitively. It presents the relationship as complex, as supportive and strained and genuine and insufficient, as the best thing in Mark's life and simultaneously not enough to fix the worst things in Mark's life. The show understands that love is not therapy. That connection is not cure. That the presence of someone who cares about you does not eliminate the need for professional intervention any more than the presence of a friend eliminates the need for a doctor when you have a broken bone. The question of identity is central to any psychological assessment of Mark Grayson, and it is the question that the show returns to more consistently than any other. Erik Erikson, the developmental psychologist who formulated the theory of psychosocial development in the 1950s, identified the primary task of adolescence as the establishment of ego identity, a coherent sense of who you are, what you value, and where you fit in the social world. Erikson described the failure to achieve this integration as identity diffusion, a state of confusion and instability in which the individual cannot commit to a stable self-concept and oscillates between contradictory versions of who they might be. Mark was in the middle of this developmental process, the normal, unremarkable process of figuring out who he was, when his father detonated his identity from the inside. Before the betrayal, Mark's identity was simple. He was Nolan's son. He was the son of a hero, and he was becoming a hero himself, and the trajectory of his life was clear, a straight line from the father's example to the son's emulation. He knew who he was because he knew whose he was. His identity was relational, anchored to the most important figure in his life, and the anchor held firm. After the betrayal, the anchor is gone, and Mark is left with a question that would challenge even a fully developed adult psyche, let alone an adolescent one. Who am I if my father is not who I thought he was? If the template I built myself on was a lie, is the self I built also a lie? If Nolan's heroism was a performance, is Mark's heroism also a performance, a copy of a copy, an imitation of something that was never real in the first place? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are clinical questions. They are the questions that sit at the center of identity disturbance in complex PTSD, the symptom that clinicians describe as a persistent disruption in the individual's sense of self. Mark does not know who he is. He knows the name on his driver's license. He knows the costume he wears. He knows the title the world has given him. But these are labels, not identities. They describe his function, not his being. And the question of his being, the question of whether he is fundamentally good or fundamentally dangerous, fundamentally human or fundamentally Viltrumite, fundamentally his mother's son or fundamentally his father's weapon, is a question that haunts him through every season and every fight and every quiet moment where the noise stops and the question gets loud. The show amplifies this identity crisis through one of its most psychologically astute narrative devices, the existence of alternate versions of Mark Grayson across the multiverse. Angstrom Levy, whose experiment involved gathering knowledge from alternate realities, reveals to Mark that in the vast majority of parallel universes, Mark Grayson does not become a hero, he becomes his father. He accepts the Viltrumite mission, he conquers Earth, he becomes the very thing that Mark, in this universe, is trying not to be. The alternate Marks are violent. They are cruel. They are everything that Mark fears he might become, and their existence is not theoretical. They are real, they exist in flesh and blood in other dimensions. And Mark has fought them, has looked into their faces and seen his own features twisted by the ideology he rejected, has confronted the physical proof that the line between who he is and who he could be is not as thick as he wants to believe. A psychologist would find this devastating. The alternate Marks function, psychologically, as a kind of externalized, intrusive thought. Most people with identity disturbance experience their fears about who they really are as internal events, as thoughts and fantasies and nightmares that can be managed, if imperfectly, through therapeutic intervention. Mark's fears are external. They have bodies. They have faces. They exist in the world as objective proof that his darkest possibility is not a fantasy, but a statistical likelihood. That in the majority of timelines, he is the monster, and in this one, he is the exception. Living with this knowledge does something specific to a person's psychology. It creates what clinicians call chronic threat to self-concept, a persistent state of anxiety organized around the fear that the self one has constructed is fragile, contingent, and potentially false. Mark cannot rest in his identity the way that people with secure self-concepts can rest in theirs. He cannot take his goodness for granted because the multiverse has shown him, in the most literal possible terms, that his goodness is not guaranteed. It is a choice. It is a choice he has to make every day, in every fight, in every moment of rage or frustration or exhaustion, where the Viltrumite instinct, the genetic predisposition toward dominance and violence that he carries in every cell of his body, pushes against the human values he learned from his mother. This is the internal war that the show depicts more honestly than almost any superhero narrative has ever attempted. It is not the war between good and evil. It is the war between two versions of the self, two possible futures, two sets of instincts that coexist within the same body and compete for control. The Viltrumite Mark wants to dominate. The human Mark wants to connect. The Viltrumite Mark sees conflict as a problem to be solved through force. The human Mark sees conflict as a problem to be solved through understanding. The two are not compatible. They cannot both win. And the energy Mark expends every day keeping the Viltrumite in check, suppressing the impulses that come as naturally to him as breathing, moderating the rage that surges when he is threatened or when the people he loves are in danger, is energy that is not available for healing, for growth, for the psychological work that his mounting trauma demands. The berserker state deserves particular clinical attention. There are moments in the show where Mark's fighting style changes. The controlled, trained movements give way to something rawer, more primal, more violent than the situation requires. His eyes change, his face changes, The animation shifts to capture something that is no longer strategy, but instinct. No longer the superhero responding to a threat, but the Viltrumite responding to a challenge. And the difference between those two responses is the difference between controlled force and uncontrolled rage. A psychologist would recognize the berserker state as a form of what is called affective flooding, the complete override of cognitive control by emotional intensity. In non-traumatized individuals, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, decision-making, and impulse control, maintains a regulatory relationship with the amygdala, moderating emotional responses and preventing them from overwhelming conscious thought. In individuals with PTSD, this regulatory relationship is compromised. The prefrontal cortex's ability to modulate amygdala activation is reduced, and the threshold for emotional override is lowered, meaning that less provocation is required to trigger a full fight-or-flight response, and the response, once triggered, is harder to terminate. Mark's berserker episodes represent moments where the Viltrumite amygdala, if such a thing exists, overwhelms the human prefrontal cortex. They are moments where the genetic inheritance from Nolan expresses itself not as power, but as rage. Not as strength, but as the loss of the restraint that makes strength meaningful. And each episode leaves a mark on Mark's psychology, not because of the physical damage he inflicts, but because of the psychological evidence he generates. Each Berserker episode proves to Mark that the alternate versions are not anomalies. They are possibilities. They are what happens when the restraint fails permanently rather than temporarily, when the rage wins not a battle but the war. The fear of becoming his father is not metaphorical for Mark. It is clinical. It is a specific, documented phenomenon in the children of abusive parents. The fear that the capacity for violence is hereditary, that the rage you witnessed in your parent lives inside you as a dormant seed waiting for the right conditions to germinate. Studies on intergenerational transmission of violence, particularly the work of Kathy Spatz Whiteham, whose longitudinal research beginning in the 1980s tracked the outcomes of abused and neglected children over decades, show that the fear itself is often more psychologically damaging than any actual inherited tendency. The child lives in a state of constant self-surveillance, monitoring their own emotional responses for signs of the parent's pathology, interpreting normal anger as evidence of incipient violence, treating every aggressive impulse as proof that the monster is waking up. Mark performs this self-surveillance constantly. Every moment of anger is examined. Every flash of violence is cataloged and compared against the template of what his father did. Every time he hits harder than he intended. Every time the rage surges past the boundary he set for it. Every time the berserker state takes him to a place where the line between justice and cruelty becomes blurred, Mark adds a data point to the case file he is building against himself. The file that asks whether he is becoming Nolan, whether the trajectory is fixed, whether the crater in Chicago was not the end of his father's influence, but the beginning of its deepest expression. This self-surveillance is exhausting in a way that makes the hypervigilance toward external threats seem manageable by comparison. External threats can be fought, they can be identified and confronted, and, at least theoretically, defeated. The internal threat, the fear of what you might become, cannot be fought because it is not separate from you. It is you. It is the part of you that you are most afraid of, the part that the alternate Marks proved is real, the part that the berserker state activates, the part that your father's blood put inside you without your consent, and without your knowledge, and without any mechanism for removal. A psychologist would want to help Mark distinguish between the fear and the reality. They would want to point out that the fear of becoming violent is not the same as being violent, that the self-surveillance Mark performs is itself evidence that he is not his father, because his father never performed it. Nolan did not worry about becoming a monster. Nolan was a monster who occasionally performed humanity. Mark is a human who occasionally manifests monstrosity. The direction is different. The starting point is different. And the fact that Mark is terrified of the monster inside him is the strongest possible evidence that the monster does not define him, because monsters are not afraid of themselves. The intergenerational dimension of Mark's trauma extends beyond the fear of becoming his father. It extends to the question of what Mark will pass on to his own children, a question that the comics explore extensively and that the show has begun to approach with the careful, deliberate pacing that characterizes its handling of all psychological material. Mark knows because the comics reader knows and because the show has hinted that Viltrumite genetics do not dilute across generations. The power does not diminish. The capacity for violence does not fade. Whatever Mark carries in his DNA, whatever combination of Viltrumite aggression and human conscience defines his internal landscape, will be transmitted in some form to any children he has. This knowledge adds a layer of existential anxiety to Mark's already overburdened psyche. It is one thing to fear that you might become your father. It is another thing entirely to fear that your children might become your father, that the pattern you are fighting to break might reassert itself in the next generation, that the violence you inherited and are spending your entire life trying to control might appear uncontrolled in a person you brought into the world. This is the specific terror of intergenerational trauma, and it is a terror that the clinical literature on children of abusive parents documents with consistent findings. The fear of repeating the cycle is one of the most common and most debilitating anxieties reported by adults who were abused or betrayed by their parents. And the irony is that the fear itself can become part of the cycle, producing in the fearful parent a hypervigilance toward their own behavior that creates the kind of rigidity and emotional distance that replicates, in altered form, the very dynamics they are trying to avoid. Mark has not yet become a parent in the show's timeline, but the psychological groundwork for this anxiety is already visible. It is visible in the way he talks about the future, with a vagueness that suggests he has difficulty imagining it. It is visible in the way he engages with the concept of family, with an intensity that carries undercurrents of both desire and dread. It is visible in the way he looks at Eve, sometimes with an expression that contains not just love, but calculation. The unconscious assessment of whether this relationship, this person, this life he might build, can survive the weight of the inheritance he carries. A psychologist working with Mark on this issue would need to address two competing distortions. The first is the catastrophizing distortion, the belief that because Nolan was violent, Mark will inevitably be violent, and any children Mark has will inevitably inherit the violence. This distortion treats the outcome as predetermined, ignoring the role of choice, environment, and the conscious effort that Mark is already demonstrating in his daily battle against the Viltrumite instinct. The second is the minimization distortion, the belief that the problem is manageable, that Mark can simply choose not to be his father, and that the choice will be sufficient. That willpower alone can override genetic predisposition and accumulated trauma and the unconscious patterns that express themselves most powerfully in the moments of greatest stress. Neither distortion is accurate. The truth, as a clinician would gently explain, is more complicated and more hopeful than either extreme. Mark is not destined to repeat his father's pattern, but he is at risk of repeating it, and the risk is elevated by the unprocessed trauma, by the identity confusion, by the hypervigilance and the moral injury and the narrowing window of tolerance and all the other symptoms that he has been accumulating for 4 seasons without adequate intervention. The risk is not a sentence, it is a probability, and probabilities can be changed. They can be reduced through awareness, through processing, through the kind of sustained therapeutic work that Mark has not yet been able to access, but that the show, if it continues to honor its psychological integrity, will eventually need to provide or at least gesture toward. The question of treatment is one that the show has deliberately left unaddressed, and the omission is itself a psychological statement. Mark does not go to therapy. He does not sit in a room with a professional and talk about his father and his fears and the crater and the 3 seconds. He does not do this because the show understands that Mark would not do this, that the combination of his defensive structure, his hyper-masculine modeling from Nolan, the superhero culture's equation of strength with stoicism, and the practical impossibility of finding a therapist with the security clearance and the clinical expertise to handle a case involving Viltrumite psychology would make the prospect of conventional therapy both unappealing and impractical. But the absence of formal treatment does not mean the absence of healing. The show suggests, through the accumulation of Mark's relationships and experiences, and the gradual, imperfect, non-linear process of learning from both, that healing can occur outside the therapeutic context, that the work of integration can happen in the field rather than in the office, that the relationships themselves, the friendships and the romantic bonds and the complicated connection with his mother and the adversarial but stabilizing relationship with Cecil, can serve as the medium in which the psychological work gets done. Even if nobody in the room has a clinical license and nobody is tracking the progress on a treatment plan, this is an imperfect form of healing. It is slower than therapy, it is less efficient, it leaves gaps that professional intervention could address, but it is the form of healing that is available to Mark. And it is the form of healing that is available to most people in the real world. People who process their trauma through living rather than through treatment, who integrate their experiences through the slow accumulation of new experiences that update the old patterns without erasing them, who get better not because someone fixed them, but because they kept going long enough for the going itself to become a form of repair. But this distinction, which is clear to a clinician observing from outside, is nearly impossible to maintain from the inside. When you are the person experiencing the rage, when you are the person whose fists just went through a wall because someone threatened the person you love, the fact that the rage originated in a protective impulse rather than a destructive one does not feel like a meaningful distinction. The wall is still broken. The rage was still there. The evidence that you are capable of the thing you fear is still fresh, and the fear feeds on evidence the way fire feeds on oxygen, growing larger with every new data point, becoming harder to contain with every new episode that proves the capacity is real. A psychologist would call this ego depletion, the theory that the self has a finite amount of regulatory energy, and that expending it on one task, such as suppressing aggressive impulses, leaves less energy available for other tasks, such as managing emotional responses or maintaining stable relationships. Mark's ego is perpetually depleted. He is spending so much of his psychological resources on not becoming his father that he has almost nothing left for the work of becoming himself. The show tracks this depletion with a precision that is visible in Mark's relationships, which deteriorate in patterns that a clinician would find textbook. The relationship with Amber Bennett, which occupies significant emotional real estate in the first 2 seasons, follows the trajectory of a trauma-avoidant attachment style. Mark loves Amber. That is clear, but his love is organized around concealment rather than vulnerability. He hides his superhero identity from her. He lies about his absences. He presents a false version of his life that omits the most significant elements of his actual experience. He does this not because he is dishonest by nature, but because the alternative, sharing the truth, would require a level of vulnerability that his traumatized psyche cannot sustain. Vulnerability for Mark is not an emotional risk. It is a physical memory. The last time Mark was fully vulnerable, fully open, fully trusting, he was standing in front of his father, and his father nearly killed him. The association between vulnerability and violence has been burned into his nervous system at a depth that conscious intention cannot override. He can want to be vulnerable with Amber. He can recognize intellectually that intimacy requires openness, and that openness requires risk. But when the moment arrives, when the conversation reaches the point where the truth would need to come out, his body intervenes. The threat detection system activates, the walls go up, the deflection begins. And Amber receives not Mark, but the performance of Mark, the version of him that is curated to avoid the specific kind of exposure that his body has learned to interpret as dangerous. Amber, to her credit and to the show's credit, recognizes this. She does not have the clinical vocabulary to name what she is seeing, but she sees it. She sees a young man who is present but not available, who is physically in the room but emotionally behind a barrier that she cannot reach through. She sees someone whose love is genuine but whose capacity for intimacy has been damaged by something he will not or cannot share. And she makes the decision that many partners of trauma survivors eventually make. The decision that staying is worse than leaving, that the version of Mark she has access to is not enough of him to build a future on, that the barrier between them is not a phase but a feature of who Mark has become. The breakup with Amber deserves closer psychological examination because it represents a pattern that the clinical literature on trauma and relationships has documented extensively. The pattern is called relational approach avoidance, and it describes the oscillating dynamic that occurs when a traumatized person simultaneously desires and fears intimacy. The desire is genuine. Mark wants connection. He wants the warmth of being known, the comfort of being held, the safety of being loved by someone who chooses to be with him. But the fear is equally genuine, and the fear operates at a deeper level than the desire, because the fear is wired into the survival system, while the desire operates at the conscious level, and when survival and consciousness conflict, survival wins. The result is a relational pattern that looks, from the outside, like inconsistency. Mark is warm and then distant. He is present and then absent. He reaches out and then pulls back. He opens a door and then slams it shut. The partner on the receiving end of this pattern does not experience it as a trauma response. They experience it as rejection, as being alternately valued and discarded, as being drawn into a closeness that is then revoked without explanation. The partner feels confused, hurt, unvalued. They do not see the mechanism underneath the behavior, the mechanism that is producing the inconsistency, not as a choice, but as a reflex, not as a statement about how much Mark values them, but as a symptom of how much his nervous system has been damaged. Amber's departure from Mark's life is, in a purely clinical sense, a healthy decision for both of them. Amber cannot heal Mark. No romantic partner can heal a partner with unprocessed trauma, because healing is not a relational process. It is an individual process that can be supported by relationships, but cannot be performed by them. And the attempt to heal a partner through love, through patience, through the willingness to endure the approach avoidance cycle indefinitely, often results in secondary traumatization of the partner, a phenomenon in which the non-traumatized person in the relationship begins to develop their own trauma symptoms through prolonged exposure to the traumatized person's dysregulation. Amber leaves before this happens to her, and the show treats her departure with respect rather than resentment. She is not the villain of Mark's love life. She is a person with healthy boundaries who recognized that the relationship she was in was not providing the kind of emotional reciprocity that a sustainable partnership requires. The fact that the reason for the emotional deficit is trauma rather than indifference does not change the reality of the deficit. Understanding the cause of a problem does not make the problem livable, and Amber's decision to prioritize her own emotional health over the project of waiting for Mark to become available is a decision that a therapist would validate even as they might feel sad about it. The show understands something important about trauma and relationships that most superhero narratives completely ignore. Trauma does not just damage the person who experiences it. It damages the relational field around that person, the network of connections that the person relies on for support and meaning, and the daily experience of being known. The damage radiates outward, like the concentric rings of a stone thrown into water, affecting everyone who comes close enough to feel the ripple. Amber felt the ripple and withdrew. Eve feels the ripple and stays. And the question of whether staying is an act of love or an act of self-sacrifice is one of the questions the show will eventually have to reckon with. There is a specific scene in Season 2 that captures the relational damage of Mark's trauma with devastating precision. Mark comes home from a fight. He is physically fine, his Viltrumite healing has already closed the wounds and mended the bones. But something in his face, in his posture, in the quality of his silence, communicates that he is not fine, that the damage from this fight was not physical, that something happened during the combat that left a mark on a part of him that Viltrumite healing cannot reach. He sits down, he does not speak. The person with him, whether it is Amber or Eve or William, asks if he is okay, and he says yes. And the word yes arrives in the room with the specific flatness of a word that has been emptied of its meaning. A word that serves as a barrier rather than a bridge. A word that says, "Do not ask me more," without saying it aloud. This scene, or variations of it, repeats dozens of times across the series. The specifics change, the fight is different, the person asking is different, the setting is different. But the structure is identical. Damage occurs. The body heals. The mind does not. Someone asks. Mark deflects. The gap between what happened and what is communicated widens by another increment. And the accumulation of these increments, the growing pile of unspoken experiences that Mark carries with him from scene to scene, from season to season, becomes itself a presence in every room he enters. A weight that the people around him can feel but cannot name. A silence that shapes the conversation even when the conversation is about something else entirely. There is another dimension of Mark's relational damage that operates beneath the surface of these conversations, and it is the dimension that a psychologist would identify as survivor's guilt compounded by the awareness of agency. Mark is not a passive victim of the events that shape his life. He is a participant. He makes choices, he decides to fight, he decides to protect, and embedded in those decisions is the knowledge that his survival often comes at the cost of someone else's suffering, that the buildings he throws opponents through contain people, that the ground he slams enemies into is ground that someone was standing on, that the shock waves of his fights ripple outward into lives he will never know about and damage he will never see. Survivor's guilt in its classical formulation describes the guilt experienced by a person who survives a situation in which others did not. Mark's version is more complex because it is not passive. He did not simply survive while others died. He acted, and his actions, the punches, the throws, the collisions that register on seismographs, contributed to the environment in which others were harmed. The guilt is not about surviving. It is about participating. It is about the growing awareness that the line between heroism and destruction is not a line at all, but a spectrum, and that Mark lives somewhere in the middle of it, saving people with one hand while endangering them with the other, and that no amount of heroic intention can erase the mathematical reality that his fights produce civilian casualties that would not have occurred if he had not been there. This guilt accumulates across seasons with a relentless arithmetic of compound interest. Each battle adds to the total. Each destroyed building, each displaced family, each hospital that fills with people injured by the secondary effects of Mark's violence adds another number to a ledger that Mark cannot stop reading, even when the page is closed. By Season 4, the ledger has become so long that Mark can no longer pretend it does not exist, can no longer comfort himself with the utilitarian calculation that the people he saved outnumber the people who were harmed. Because the calculation is not the point. The point is that both numbers are real, and the people represented by both numbers are real, and the difference between a hero and a natural disaster is intention. And intention is cold comfort to the family whose house was destroyed by a body that Mark threw through it. The guilt interferes with Mark's tactical judgment in ways that a combat psychologist would find clinically significant. He hesitates before engaging opponents in populated areas, not because he is strategically assessing the terrain, but because the pre-battle calculation of potential civilian harm has become so emotionally charged that it produces a freeze response, a momentary paralysis that is not tactical caution but psychological overwhelm. He pulls punches that should not be pulled. Not because the opponent does not deserve full force, a city block collapsed and 17 people were hospitalized. And the memory of that number, 17, lives in his arms now, in his fists, in the machinery that translates intention into impact. The psychological term for this is moral distress, and it is distinct from moral injury. Moral injury describes the damage already done to the self-concept. Moral distress describes the ongoing anguish of being unable to take the morally correct action, because circumstances prevent it. Mark cannot fight without collateral damage. The physics of Viltrumite combat guarantee it. Every engagement produces destruction that Mark's moral framework says should not happen, but his vocational reality says cannot be avoided. And the gap between what should be and what is fills with a distress that has no resolution because the conditions that produce it cannot be changed. This is the cruelest aspect of Mark's psychology. He is trapped in a role that continuously violates his own values. And there is no exit from the role that does not produce its own moral consequences. If he stops fighting, people die from the threats he could have stopped. If he keeps fighting, people die from the damage he causes. The moral calculation is a closed loop with no positive outcome. A trolley problem that repeats every week with different numbers but the same impossible structure. And the toll of living inside that structure, of waking up every morning knowing that the day will require him to make choices that violate something he believes in no matter which option he selects, is a toll that no amount of Viltrumite durability can offset. The continuous deployment without stand-down is something that military psychologists have studied extensively, and their findings are not encouraging. The research is clear that human beings, even highly trained, highly resilient ones, require periods of psychological recovery between exposure to traumatic stressors. The minimum recommended interval varies by study, but the consensus is that continuous exposure without recovery leads inevitably to degradation of function, to the erosion of judgment, empathy, impulse control, and emotional regulation that constitutes the clinical picture of combat-related psychological injury. Mark has had no stand-down. From the moment Nolan revealed himself in Season 1, Mark has been in continuous deployment, facing threats that range from the merely violent to the genuinely existential, with no period of sufficient safety and duration to allow the kind of psychological recovery that the research says is necessary. Steven Yeun's voice performance across the 4 seasons serves as an auditory map of this psychological deterioration, and it is worth examining in clinical terms because the changes in his delivery mirror with remarkable precision the changes that a psychologist would expect to see in a person undergoing the trajectory that Mark undergoes. In Season 1, Yeun's Mark is bright. The voice has the natural buoyancy of a 17-year-old who is excited about his powers, uncertain about his place in the world, but fundamentally optimistic. The words have air in them. The sentences have lift. Even in moments of stress, the voice retains a quality of resilience, a bounce back that communicates the underlying belief that things will work out, that the world is basically safe, that the people in it are basically good. By Season 2, the brightness has dimmed. The voice is lower, not dramatically, not in a way that calls attention to itself, but in the way that a clinician would notice, the way that a person's voice drops when they are carrying something they have not put down for a long time. The buoyancy is still there in moments, when Mark is with his friends, when he is with his mother, when the situation allows for lightness. But the default register has shifted downward, and the effort required to return to the earlier brightness is audible. The way a person who is pretending to be fine sounds subtly different from a person who actually is fine. Season 3's Mark speaks with what a clinician would describe as a flattened affect. Not in every scene, not consistently, but frequently enough that the pattern is visible. The emotional range has narrowed, the highs are not as high, the lows are not as low. The voice has developed a quality of containment, of emotion being managed rather than felt, of words being selected for their protective function rather than their expressive accuracy. Mark still says "I'm fine" in Season 3, but the way Yeun delivers the line has changed. In Season 1, "I'm fine" was a statement. In Season 3, it is a performance, and the gap between the statement and the performance is the gap that the trauma has created, the space between what Mark feels and what Mark allows himself to communicate. By Season 4, Yeun's delivery has reached the clinical territory. The voice has the quality that psychologists who work with severely traumatized patients would recognize immediately. The quality of a person who has passed through the phases of acute distress, denial, effortful coping, and arrive at the phase where the coping itself has become exhausting, and the effort to maintain the performance of normalcy is consuming resources that the person cannot afford to spend. Mark's voice in Season 4 is tired in a way that sleep cannot fix, heavy in a way that has nothing to do with the physical, controlled in a way that communicates not strength but the desperate management of something that is threatening to become unmanageable. It is one of the most precise vocal portrayals of progressive psychological deterioration in animated media, and its precision lies not in dramatic moments of breakdown, but in the accumulated weight of hundreds of small vocal choices that track the trajectory of a mind that is losing its ability to carry what has been placed on it. The relationship with Adam Eve, Samantha Eve Wilkins, follows a different pattern because Eve has the context that Amber lacked. Eve is a superhero. She knows what Mark does. She understands the dangers, the absences, the injuries, the emotional toll. She does not need Mark to translate his experience into civilian terms because she lives in the same world. The barrier that separated Mark from Amber, the barrier of concealment, does not exist with Eve. She can see Mark more fully than Amber ever could. But context is not the same as healing. Eve can understand Mark's trauma, but understanding trauma and being able to help someone process it are not the same thing. Eve has her own psychological burdens, her own history of parental manipulation, her own complicated relationship with her powers, her own version of the identity question that plagues Mark. The relationship between them is not therapeutic. It is two wounded people leaning on each other, which can be stabilizing in a short term and destabilizing in the long term, because the weight one person puts on the other is weight the other may not be able to carry indefinitely. A psychologist would note that Mark's pattern in relationships reflects a broader pattern in his life, the pattern of seeking connection while simultaneously sabotaging it, of wanting closeness while fearing what closeness requires, of building bonds that can never quite bear the full weight of who he is. Because the full weight of who he is includes elements, the Viltrumite nature, the violence, the potential for destruction that he believes would break any bond that tried to hold them. This is the relational legacy of betrayal trauma. The person who was betrayed by their primary attachment figure does not simply lose trust in that person. They lose trust in the mechanism of trust itself. They learn at a level deeper than conscious thought that the act of trusting is the act that creates vulnerability, and vulnerability is the thing that gets you hurt. The lesson is not about Nolan specifically. The lesson is about the architecture of human connection. And the lesson Mark learned in that crater in Chicago is that the architecture can collapse without warning, and the collapse can come from the person you least expect. And the only way to prevent the collapse is to never build the architecture in the first place. Mark builds it anyway. That is the thing that makes his story not just tragic, but heroic in the truest psychological sense. He builds relationships even though his body tells him not to. He opens himself to Eve even though every survival instinct he possesses screams that openness is dangerous. He loves his mother, his friends, his teammates, even though love for Mark is permanently associated with the possibility of catastrophic loss. He does these things not because he is healed. He is not healed. He does them because his mother's humanity, the part of him that Debbie built through 20 years of dinners and conversations, and the quiet, invisible labor of being present, is strong enough to override the Viltrumite lesson that says trust is weakness and vulnerability is death. Season 4, which premiered on March 18, 2026, takes Mark's psychological deterioration to its most extreme point. The Viltrumite war is over. The immediate threats have been addressed. The world is comparatively safer than it has been since the series began. And this is precisely the moment where Mark's psychology begins to collapse, because the absence of external threat removes the thing that was holding him together, the crisis, the constant danger, the perpetual emergency that gave his survival behavior a context and a purpose. When the fighting stops, the mind catches up. This is a phenomenon that psychologists who work with combat veterans know well. It is called the re-entry problem, and it describes the paradoxical deterioration that occurs when a person leaves a high-threat environment and enters a low-threat one. The nervous system, which has been running at maximum alert for an extended period, does not downregulate smoothly. It does not transition from combat readiness to peacetime rest in a gentle, linear fashion. Instead, it continues to fire at the same intensity, producing the same cascade of stress hormones, the same hypervigilant scanning, the same readiness for violence, but now without the external stimuli that would justify the activation. The result is that the person feels more anxious in safety than they did in danger, because in danger, the anxiety had a purpose. In safety, the anxiety has no outlet, and the energy it generates turns inward, producing the flashbacks and nightmares and intrusive thoughts that are the hallmark of PTSD's delayed presentation. Mark in Season 4 begins experiencing intrusive visions. He sees Thrag, he sees the Viltrumites, he sees scenarios in which the people he loves, Debbie, Eve, William, are killed by threats he failed to prevent. These visions are not premonitions. They are not supernatural. They are the clinical symptom of a mind that has been running in threat mode for so long that it has lost the ability to distinguish between real and imagined danger, between a threat that is present and a threat that is remembered, between the world as it is and the world as the traumatized brain has learned to expect it. The show depicts these visions with increasing frequency and intensity as season 4 progresses, and the effect on Mark is visible. He is more aggressive, he is quicker to anger, he makes decisions that the earlier version of himself would have recognized as disproportionate, using more force than necessary, responding to minor provocations with major escalation, treating every confrontation as though it is the fight that will determine the fate of the planet. He is, in clinical language, decompensating, the psychological term for the process by which coping mechanisms that were previously adequate begin to fail under accumulated stress. Robert Kirkman, the creator of Invincible, has described Mark's Season 4 arc as a radical change for the character. And the change is indeed radical in the psychological sense. Mark is not getting better, he is getting worse. The accumulation of unprocessed trauma, the identity conflict, the relational difficulties, the constant state of threat, the progressive erosion of the coping mechanisms that kept him functional, all of it is converging in Season 4 toward a breaking point that the show has been building towards since the first episode. The breaking point is not a single event, it is a gradual collapse, like a building whose foundations have been weakened by years of invisible damage and that finally begins to lean, almost imperceptibly at first, then with increasing speed, then with the terrible momentum of a structure that has passed the point of repair and is now simply following the physics of its own disintegration. The moral injury dimension of Mark's trauma is something that deserves its own clinical examination, because it operates on a different axis than the PTSD symptoms, and produces a different kind of damage. Moral injury, a concept originally developed by the psychiatrist Jonathan Shea in his work with Vietnam veterans, describes the psychological harm that occurs when a person participates in, witnesses, or fails to prevent events that violate their deeply held moral beliefs. Unlike PTSD, which is rooted in fear, moral injury is rooted in shame. The traumatic material is not the threat to the self, but the damage to the self-concept, the discovery that you are capable of things you believed you were not, or that you failed to do things you believed you would. Mark accumulates moral injuries throughout the series with the same relentless consistency that he accumulates physical ones. The first and most significant is the failure to stop his father. Mark was there, he had powers, he fought, and he lost. The rational part of his mind knows that he was outmatched, that a 17-year-old half-Viltrumite could not have defeated a full-blooded Viltrumite warrior with thousands of years of combat experience. But moral injury does not operate rationally. It operates on the level of belief, of identity, of the promises a person makes to themselves about who they will be in the moments that matter. Mark promised himself, implicitly, through every act of heroism he performed before the betrayal, that he would protect people, he would stop violence, he would stand between the innocent and the powerful. And when the moment came, when the powerful was his own father and the innocent were 7 dead guardians in a city full of terrified civilians, he could not do it. He could not stop it. He was not enough. The shame of this failure lives inside Mark in a place that is different from where the fear lives. The fear is in the amygdala, in the automatic threat response, in the body that scans and flinches and cannot rest. The shame is in the narrative, in the story Mark tells himself about who he is, in the gap between the hero he claims to be and the boy who lay in a crater while his father decided whether to finish the job or fly away. The fear makes Mark hyper-vigilant. The shame makes Mark reckless. The fear says be careful, the shame says be better. And the tension between these two commands, the command to protect yourself and the command to prove yourself, produces the specific pattern of risk-taking behavior that characterizes Mark's approach to combat in the later seasons. Mark takes risks that are not necessary. He absorbs damage that he could avoid. He places himself in situations that a more strategically minded hero would recognize as unnecessarily dangerous. And the audience watching this might interpret it as bravery, as the heroic willingness to sacrifice personal safety for the greater good. But a clinician would see something different. A clinician would see compensatory behavior, the attempt to pay a debt that the psyche believes it owes, the unconscious drive to make up for the failure that started everything by succeeding now, by being enough now, by absorbing enough punishment now to retroactively prove that the boy in the crater was not weak, was not insufficient, was not the failure that the shame insists he was. This is the psychological engine that drives Mark's increasingly reckless behavior in Season 4. And it is an engine that runs on a fuel that never depletes, because the original failure can never be undone. Mark can save 1,000 people and the shame will not diminish. Because the shame is not about the 1,000 people. It is about the 7. It is about the crater. It is about the 3 seconds where his father's fist was raised and Mark could not stop it. No amount of subsequent heroism can change those 3 seconds. They are fixed. They are permanent. They are the foundation of the moral injury, and the injury will continue to produce compensatory behavior until Mark finds a way to address not the behavior, but the belief underneath it. The belief that he was not enough, that he should have been more, that the boy in the crater failed and the hero in the costume is an apology for that failure. There is also the matter of what Mark has done, not just what he has failed to prevent. The fights Mark engages in are not clean. They are not the bloodless, consequence-free encounters of lighter superhero fiction, where the hero punches the villain and the villain falls down and the building is repaired by the next episode. Mark's fights produce casualties. They produce collateral damage. They produce the kind of real-world consequences: destroyed buildings, injured bystanders, environments permanently altered by the force of superhuman combat that the show refuses to ignore, and that Mark, whose moral compass is calibrated to a higher standard than most, cannot ignore either. Every civilian who is hurt because Mark's fight extended beyond the space he could control adds to the moral injury. Every building that collapses because the force of a punch was greater than the structural integrity of the concrete adds to the guilt. Every face in the crowd that registers fear, not gratitude, when they see Mark approaching adds to the accumulating evidence that Mark's presence in the world is as much a source of danger as it is a source of protection. The hero and the threat are the same person, and the moral injury of that identity, the knowledge that saving people and endangering people are not opposites but twins, that every rescue is also a risk, that the power that allows him to protect is the same power that allows him to destroy, is a psychological burden that the genre typically ignores and that Invincible refuses to look away from. Mark is aware of this. He does not articulate it in clinical language. He does not sit with a therapist and describe the specific contours of his moral injury. But the awareness lives in him, in the hesitation that sometimes precedes his intervention in a crisis, in the calculation he performs before entering a fight about whether his presence will cause more damage than his absence, in the guilt that follows battles where the outcome was successful but the process was destructive. He saves people and then he counts the cost, and the cost is always higher than 0, and the gap between 0 and the actual number is the space where the moral injury grows. This is why the show's title becomes increasingly ironic as the series progresses. Invincible is not just a statement about Mark's physical durability. It is a statement about the fantasy that heroism can be performed without cost, that the powerful can protect the vulnerable without simultaneously threatening them, that the violence required to stop violence can be contained within boundaries that prevent it from becoming part of the problem it is trying to solve. The title promises invincibility, the show delivers vulnerability. The gap between the promise and the delivery is the space where Mark's psychology lives, stretched between the person the name says he should be and the person the experiences have made him. The intergenerational dimension of Mark's trauma extends beyond the personal relationship with Nolan and into the broader question of cultural inheritance, a question that the show examines with a specificity that elevates it from family drama to cultural psychology. Mark does not just carry his father's violence, he carries his father's species. He carries the genetic inheritance of a civilization that organized itself around the principles of conquest, domination, and the survival of the strongest. A civilization that did not develop concepts like empathy, compassion, or democratic governance because those concepts, in the Viltrumite framework, are weaknesses that evolution should have eliminated. The psychological literature on children of violent cultures, children who were born into systems where violence is not an aberration but a norm, a value, a defining characteristic of the culture itself, suggests that these children face a unique identity challenge. They must simultaneously acknowledge the culture as part of their identity and reject the values that the culture embodies. They must say, "This is where I come from," and "This is not who I am" in the same breath. And the contradiction between those two statements is a contradiction that the psyche struggles to hold, because identity, at its deepest level, resists fragmentation. The mind wants coherence. It wants the pieces of the self to fit together into a recognizable whole. And when some of the pieces are fundamentally incompatible with the others, the mind faces a choice between integration and repression, between acknowledging the unwanted parts and pretending they do not exist. Mark chooses acknowledgement eventually, and that choice is what separates him from many of the other Viltrumite hybrids and from the alternate versions of himself that the show introduces as cautionary tales. The alternate Marks, the ones who became tyrants, the ones who became their fathers, are the versions who chose repression, who denied the human parts of themselves in favor of the Viltrumite parts. Not because the Viltrumite parts were stronger, but because the Viltrumite parts offered a simple narrative. Conquest is simple. The morality of might makes right is brutally uncomplicated compared to the morality of trying to be good in a world that does not always reward goodness, of trying to protect people who sometimes fear you more than they appreciate you, of trying to be human when half of your DNA says that humanity is a phase your species should have outgrown. A developmental psychologist would identify this as the central developmental task of Mark's adolescence and young adulthood, the task of identity formation in the context of a bicultural heritage where the two cultures are not merely different but actively hostile to each other. The Viltrumite value system does not simply disagree with the human value system. It views the human value system as evidence of weakness, as a symptom of a species that has not yet earned its right to exist. And Mark, who carries both systems in his blood, must navigate between them with no map and no guide, because there is no precedent for what he is. No textbook on how to be half human and half conqueror. No therapeutic protocol for the child who discovers that one of his parents belongs to a species that considers his other parent's species to be less than animals. The psychological concept of bicultural identity stress, which has been studied extensively in the context of immigrant children and children of mixed cultural backgrounds, offers some clinical framework for understanding Mark's experience. Though the framework requires significant adaptation because the gap between Mark's two cultures is orders of magnitude larger than the gap between any two human cultures. Bicultural identity stress describes the psychological strain that occurs when a person is expected to navigate between two cultural systems that have different, sometimes conflicting values, norms, and expectations. The person must code switch between the two systems, adopting the appropriate identity for each context. And the cognitive and emotional effort required to maintain this constant switching produces measurable psychological strain. Mark's code switching is not between languages or social norms. It is between definitions of what it means to be good. In the human context, goodness means compassion, sacrifice, protection of the vulnerable, respect for individual autonomy. In the Viltrumite context, goodness means strength, conquest, genetic superiority, the advancement of the species through the elimination of the weak. Mark cannot hold both definitions simultaneously because they are mutually exclusive. To be good by one standard is to be deficient by the other, and the impossibility of satisfying both standards simultaneously produces a form of identity paralysis that manifests in Mark's chronic difficulty making decisions, his tendency to defer to authority figures like Cecil, and his habit of acting impulsively and then regretting the action, as though the part of him that chose was not the part that would have to live with the consequences. The physical manifestations of this bicultural identity stress are visible in the way Mark relates to his own body. His body is Viltrumite. It is designed for violence. The muscles, the bones, the cellular structure, everything about his physical form is optimized for combat, for destruction, for the specific kind of interaction with the physical world that the Viltrumite civilization valued above all others. And Mark, who has chosen to define himself through human values, lives inside this body with the discomfort of a person who has been given a tool they do not want, a weapon they did not ask for, a physical inheritance that contradicts the psychological identity they are trying to build. There is a moment in Season 3 where Mark looks at his own hands after a fight, and the look on his face, the specific quality of recognition and revulsion that passes across his features, communicates something that dialogue could not convey. He is looking at instruments of Viltrumite violence and seeing them as his own hands. He is looking at the genetic inheritance of a species of conquerors and seeing it as his body. The horror is not about what his hands did. The horror is about what his hands are, about what they were built to do, about the fact that the ease with which they destroy is not a skill he developed, but a capacity he was born with, written into his DNA by a civilization that considered the ability to destroy a virtue rather than a liability. This somatic dimension of Mark's identity conflict is something that the psychological literature is only beginning to address, because the literature has not previously needed to consider the case of a person whose body is literally built for a purpose that their psychology rejects. But the closest analog in existing research is the literature on somatic identity disturbance, the experience of feeling alienated from one's own body, of experiencing the body as other rather than self, of living inside a physical form that feels like it belongs to someone else. Mark's body belongs to Viltrumite heritage, his mind belongs to human upbringing, and the gap between body and mind, between what he can do and what he believes he should do, between the species that built his muscles and the species that built his conscience, is a gap that grows wider with every season, producing an increasing sense of internal alienation that contributes to the decompensation visible in Season 4. The genius of Invincible as a psychological text is that it refuses to resolve this conflict through the easy narrative of choosing one side over the other. Mark does not reject his Viltrumite heritage entirely, because doing so would mean rejecting his father entirely, and the attachment to Nolan, despite everything, despite the betrayal and the violence and the lies, persists in Mark's psychology with the stubborn persistence of an attachment bond that was formed in infancy and reinforced through years of experience before the betrayal occurred. The bond was real before it was violated, and its reality before the violation gives it a weight that the violation cannot fully erase. Mark still loves his father, he still wants his father's approval. He still carries the internal image of the Nolan who played catch with him in the backyard, who told him stories, who represented safety and strength and certainty. And this image coexists with the image of the Nolan who stood over him in a crater in Chicago with blood on his fists. And both images are true, and neither cancels the other. And the inability to reconcile them is the motor that drives Mark's psychology across the entire series. A psychologist watching Mark in Season 4 would be worried. Not worried about his physical survival. His body can survive anything. Worried about his psychological survival. Worried about what happens when a person with Viltrumite power and human psychology reaches the point where the human psychology can no longer contain the Viltrumite impulses. Worried about the alternate Marks, the ones from other dimensions who started good and ended monstrous, and whether the line between this Mark and those Marks is as firm as Mark needs to believe it is. The show is asking the same question, and it is asking it with the kind of clinical specificity that elevates the question beyond superhero drama and into the territory of genuine psychological inquiry. What happens to a mind that cannot heal because the world will not let it? What happens to a person whose body is invincible but whose psychology is as fragile as anyone else's? What happens when the coping mechanisms run out and the trauma is still there, undimmed, unprocessed, waiting in the silence that fills the spaces between the fights? The answer the show has been building toward across 4 seasons is that what happens is transformation, not healing. Transformation is not the same as healing. Healing implies a return to the state that existed before the damage. Mark cannot return to the 17-year-old who trusted his father. That person is gone. The crater in Chicago buried him. What transformation means in the psychological sense is the construction of a new self from the materials left behind by the destruction of the old one. It is the integration of the trauma into the identity, not as a wound that defines the person, but as an experience that shapes them, that informs their choices, that gives them a depth and a gravity that the undamaged version of themselves would not have possessed. Post-traumatic growth, the term that psychologists use for this process, is not guaranteed. It is not common. It requires specific conditions, the right support, the right internal resources, the right balance between challenge and safety. Mark has some of these conditions. He has Eve. He has Debbie. He has friends who care about him, a community that values him, a purpose that gives his suffering meaning. But he also lacks critical conditions. He lacks the ability to step away from the threat environment. He lacks the time and space that genuine processing requires. The show has not yet shown whether Mark will achieve post-traumatic growth or whether he will continue the downward trajectory that Season 4 has established. The story is unfinished. The transformation is incomplete. And the uncertainty, the genuine uncertainty about whether Mark Grayson will emerge from his trauma as a more integrated version of himself or as a more broken one, is itself a psychologically honest choice. Real recovery is uncertain. Real transformation is not guaranteed. Real human beings who experience what Mark has experienced do not always grow. Sometimes they decompensate, sometimes they break, sometimes the damage is more than the mind can integrate. And the person who emerges from the other side is not the person who went in. And not the person they wanted to become, but something else entirely. Something shaped by the trauma in ways that resist categorization. The relationship between Mark and his mother Debbie is the psychological anchor that prevents Mark's complete disintegration. And a clinician examining Mark's case would pay particular attention to the quality and nature of this bond, because it is the one attachment relationship in Mark's life that has survived every catastrophe intact. Debbie did not betray him. Debbie did not lie to him. Debbie did not use him as a tool for an alien agenda. Debbie was as deceived as Mark was, and the shared experience of being deceived by the same person creates a bond between them that is qualitatively different from any other relationship Mark has. In attachment theory, when the primary attachment figure, in this case the father, becomes a source of threat, the child's attachment system redirects toward the remaining safe figure. The redirection is not a conscious choice. It is an automatic response of a system that requires at least one secure base to function, the way a building that loses one load-bearing wall redirects its weight to the remaining walls. Mark's attachment system, after the loss of Nolan as a safe figure, redirected almost entirely toward Debbie, making her the single most important psychological resource in his life. The one person whose constancy allows him to take the risks that his superhero role requires. This redirection has both protective and burdensome dimensions. It protects Mark because it gives him a secure base, a person he can return to, a relationship that functions as evidence that not all attachments are lies, that not all love is a cover story, that the trust he extends to his mother has not been and will not be betrayed. Every conversation Mark has with Debbie, every time he calls her from his dorm room or visits her at the house, is a small act of psychological maintenance, a way of checking that the secure base is still there, that the remaining wall is still standing, that the attachment system has at least one anchor that holds. But the redirection also burdens Debbie in ways that neither she nor Mark fully understand. When a child's entire attachment system is organized around a single figure, that figure becomes essential in a way that exceeds normal parental importance. They become the linchpin, the one person whose loss would be psychologically catastrophic, the one relationship whose failure would replicate the original betrayal and confirm the traumatized mind's worst belief, that no one can be trusted, that all attachment is a form of risk, that the only way to avoid being destroyed by love is to refuse it entirely. Mark does not consciously think about this. He does not sit in his room calculating the psychological consequences of losing his mother, but the calculation runs underneath his conscious awareness, in the machinery of the attachment system, and it produces behaviors that are visible even though their source is not. Mark checks on Debbie more than he needs to. He calls her at odd hours. He flies by the house when he is in the area, not to visit, just to verify that the house is still there, that the light is still on, that the world has not taken the last safe person from him while he was not looking. A clinician would recognize this behavior as proximity seeking under threat, one of the cardinal features of anxious attachment. In secure attachment, the child does not need to constantly verify the caregiver's presence. They carry an internal representation of the caregiver, a mental model that provides comfort even in the caregiver's physical absence. In anxious attachment, the internal representation is unreliable, and the child needs external confirmation, needs to see the caregiver, needs to hear their voice, needs physical proof that the attachment has not been severed while they were away. Mark's attachment to Debbie has become anxious since Nolan's departure. Not because Debbie has done anything to undermine it, because the experience of losing one parent to betrayal has taught Mark's attachment system that parents can disappear, that the people you depend on most can vanish without warning, that the internal representation is not reliable because the person it represents might not be who you think they are. The lesson was about Nolan. The anxiety is about everyone, Debbie included, because the attachment system does not discriminate between the person who caused the wound and the people who might, in the system's traumatized logic, cause a similar wound in the future. Debbie handles this with the intuitive sensitivity of a mother who understands, without the clinical vocabulary to express it, that her son needs something from her that goes beyond normal parenting. She answers the phone when Mark calls. She does not ask why he is calling at 2 in the morning. She does not point out that he just called yesterday, or that his voice has the tight, controlled quality of someone who is checking on a patient. She provides the reassurance without naming it, offers the secure base without drawing attention to the fact that it is being sought, maintains the attachment without burdening Mark with the awareness that his attachment behavior has changed, that the easy confidence of the pre-betrayal Mark has been replaced by something more vigilant, more fragile, more dependent on verification. This is Debbie's contribution to Mark's psychological survival, and it is a contribution that operates almost entirely outside the visible narrative. The show does not draw attention to it. There is no scene where Debbie realizes what she's doing and names it. There is no dialogue in which Mark acknowledges his heightened need for his mother's presence. There is simply the repeated image of a phone call, a check-in, a brief moment of connection between a mother and a son who have both been damaged by the same man and who are both, in their separate ways, using the other as proof that the damage did not destroy everything. The relationship between Mark and Cecil Stedman adds another layer to the psychological portrait, because Cecil occupies the role that Nolan vacated: the authority figure, the mentor, the older male presence who guides Mark through the world of power and responsibility. And the dynamics of this replacement relationship reveal, with uncomfortable clarity, the patterns that Mark's trauma has embedded in his approach to authority. Mark does not trust Cecil. This is not a character flaw. It is a trauma response. The last authority figure Mark trusted turned out to be an enemy of the species, and the association between paternal authority and betrayal has been burned into Mark's psychology at a depth that no amount of Cecil's reliability can reach. Cecil has never lied to Mark about his ultimate loyalties. Cecil has been transparent about his pragmatism, about his willingness to make difficult decisions, about the fact that his primary commitment is to the survival of the planet, rather than to the well-being of any individual person. Cecil is, in his own way, honest, but his honesty does not earn Mark's trust, because Mark's trust mechanism has been damaged, and the damage affects all authority figures, not just the one who caused it. A clinician would identify this as a transference pattern, the process by which feelings and expectations originally attached to one relationship are unconsciously transferred to another. Mark transfers his feelings about Nolan onto Cecil, treating Cecil with a suspicion and a combativeness that is disproportionate to Cecil's actual behavior. He watches Cecil for signs of deception. He questions Cecil's motives. He pushes back against Cecil's directives with a vehemence that surprises Cecil and that Mark himself does not fully understand. Because the vehemence is not entirely about Cecil. It is about Nolan. It is the anger that Mark could not safely express toward his father, redirected toward a safer target, a man who is powerful but not Viltrumite, a man who can absorb Mark's defiance without the encounter ending in violence. Cecil, to his credit, absorbs it. He does not take Mark's hostility personally, not because he is above personal feelings, but because he understands, on a practical level, that Mark is damaged and that the damage manifests as difficulty with authority. Cecil is not a therapist. He does not have the tools or the inclination to help Mark process his transference. But he has the pragmatic wisdom to recognize that the anger directed at him is not really about him, and the patience to continue working with Mark despite the friction, providing a consistency that, over time, might begin to update Mark's internal model of what authority figures are. The updating is slow, it may never be complete, but the process itself, the gradual incremental testing of an authority figure who is flawed but not treacherous, pragmatic but not deceptive, powerful but not Viltrumite, is a form of natural therapeutic exposure. Each interaction with Cecil that does not end in betrayal adds a small data point to Mark's database of experiences with authority. Each time Cecil does what he says he will do, each time he is honest about his calculations and transparent about his methods, the database grows, and the generalization that all authority figures are liars becomes slightly less absolute, slightly more nuanced, slightly more capable of distinguishing between the man who destroyed Mark's world and the man who is trying, imperfectly but genuinely, to help him navigate it. There is one more relationship that demands clinical attention, and it is the relationship between Mark and the concept of Nolan himself. Not Nolan the person, but Nolan the presence, the figure that lives inside Mark's psychology as both wound and template, both the source of his deepest trauma and the standard against which he unconsciously measures every aspect of his own performance. Mark does not talk about Nolan often. When he does, his voice shifts in ways that Sandra Oh's counterpart, Stephen Yeun, calibrates with the same precision that Oh brings to Debbie's scenes. The shift is subtle, a slight tightening, a controlled flatness that covers something less controlled underneath. The voice of a person who is managing their internal response while simultaneously trying to communicate about the thing that produced the response. It is the voice of compartmentalization in real time, the audible evidence of a mind that has built walls between its functional areas and its wounded areas, and that is working in the moment of speech to keep those walls intact. A psychologist would note that Mark's relationship with the internalized Nolan follows a pattern called the introjected aggressor, a concept from object relations theory that describes the process by which a child internalizes not just the loving aspects of a parent, but also the threatening aspects, creating an internal figure that combines the qualities of the real parent with the qualities the child attributes to them. Mark's internalized Nolan is harsher than the real Nolan, more absolute in his judgments, more certain of his contempt, more convinced that Mark's humanity is a weakness rather than a strength. The internalized Nolan is the voice that tells Mark he is not strong enough, not fast enough, not Viltrumite enough. It is the voice that converts every failure into evidence of insufficiency, and every success into evidence that the next failure is imminent. This internal voice is not Nolan. It is Mark's construction, built from the materials of the betrayal and maintained by the trauma that keeps those materials active in his psyche. The real Nolan, as the show has demonstrated across multiple seasons, is more complicated than the internalized version. The real Nolan contains ambiguity, contains genuine feeling, contains the capacity for growth and change that the internalized version does not allow. But Mark does not have access to the real Nolan's internal experience. He has access only to his own experience of Nolan, which was shaped by the betrayal and which remains, in the absence of therapeutic processing, frozen at the moment of maximum pain. The internalized Nolan is the critic that Mark cannot silence. It is the voice that activates in moments of doubt, in moments of exhaustion, in moments where Mark's human limitations collide with the Viltrumite expectations he carries. It is the voice that says, "Pet," not out loud, not in words, but in the specific quality of inadequacy that floods Mark's consciousness when he fails, when he is not enough. When the gap between what he can do and what the situation requires becomes visible, the voice does not belong to Nolan anymore. It belongs to Mark. It has been internalized so thoroughly that Mark experiences it as his own thought rather than an echo of his father's. And this misattribution is itself a clinical phenomenon, the process by which external criticism becomes internal self-criticism, the process by which the abuser's voice becomes the victim's inner monologue. Healing from an interjected aggressor requires the person to recognize the voice as external in origin, to identify it as a product of the traumatic relationship rather than as an accurate reflection of the self. This recognition is difficult under any circumstances. It is especially difficult for Mark because the voice carries the authority of a parent, the weight of 17 years of modeling, the specific power that fathers have over sons, the power to define what masculinity looks like, what strength looks like, what success looks like. Nolan defined all of these things for Mark before the betrayal, and the definitions did not disappear when the definer was revealed to be a fraud. They persist, embedded in Mark's psyche like shrapnel that the body has grown around, incorporated into the structure of who he is, even as they continue to cause damage from the inside. The work of extracting the shrapnel, of identifying the internalized Nolan and separating his voice from Mark's own, of distinguishing between the self that Mark has chosen and the self that Nolan imposed, is the deepest and most important psychological work that Mark will ever need to do. It is work that the show has not yet depicted, because the show understands that this work cannot happen while the world is ending, while the fights continue, while the crisis mode persists. This work requires peace. It requires time. It requires the specific conditions of safety and sustained reflection that Mark's life has never provided and may never provide. And so the voice persists. The internalized Nolan speaks. Mark listens, not because he wants to, not because he agrees, but because the voice is inside him and he has not yet learned the skill of not listening. The skill of recognizing the thought as foreign. The skill of hearing the criticism and responding not with compliance or defiance, but with the simple, devastating recognition that the voice is not his. That the judgment is not true, that the boy in the crater was not weak, was not insufficient, was not a pet. He was a child. He was a child who trusted his father, and the trust was not the mistake. The father was. There is one more element of Mark's psychology that a clinician would want to address, and it is the element that the show embeds in its very title. The name Invincible is not just a superhero alias. It is a psychological defense mechanism. It is Mark's answer to the vulnerability that destroyed his world. The declarative statement that he cannot be beaten, cannot be broken, cannot be reduced to the terrified boy in the crater. The name is armor. It is the verbal equivalent of the costume, a boundary between the self and the world, a shield that declares to every potential threat that this person is beyond harm. But the declaration is false. Mark is not invincible. He is beaten constantly. He is broken repeatedly. He is reduced in his worst moments to exactly the terrified boy he is trying not to be. And the gap between the name and the reality, between the invincible hero and the traumatized teenager, is the gap that his psychology is being stretched across, wider and wider, with every season and every fight and every new piece of unprocessed damage that is added to the pile. A psychologist would call this identity incongruence, the state of dissonance that exists when a person's self-concept does not match their lived experience. Mark believes he should be invincible. He tells himself he is invincible. He presents to the world as invincible. And every time the world demonstrates that he is not, the incongruence deepens, and the energy required to maintain the false self-concept increases, and the resources available for genuine self-understanding decrease. The name is the problem and the promise. It is the thing that keeps Mark in the fight, the thing that gives him a reason to get up after every defeat, the thing that converts the passive experience of being beaten into the active narrative of being unbeatable. Without the name, Mark is a traumatized young man with a broken attachment to his father and a nervous system that will not let him rest. With the name, he is something more, something aspirational, something that the world needs and that he needs the world to believe he is. The psychologist in the room would want to gently, carefully, with the patience that Mark's defensive structure requires, explore the possibility that the name is not helping him, that the insistence on invincibility is itself a form of denial, a refusal to acknowledge the damage, a barrier between Mark and the vulnerability that genuine healing requires. To heal, Mark would need to stop being invincible for long enough to be Mark. He would need to take off the costume, not literally but psychologically, and sit with the boy in the crater and acknowledge that the boy was not invincible, that the boy was hurt, that the hurt was real, that no amount of Viltrumite healing can close the wound that his father opened. But Mark cannot do that. Not yet, maybe not ever. Because the world needs Invincible. The world needs someone who can be punched through a mountain and get back up. The world needs the name and the costume and the declaration that something in this universe is beyond harm. And Mark, who learned from his mother that other people's needs are worth sacrificing for, who absorbed from Debbie the lesson that love means putting yourself second, carries the world's need on his shoulders alongside his own unprocessed trauma. And the combined weight of both is the thing that bends him, that strains him, that threatens to break him in ways his body cannot express and his mind cannot heal. Remember the crater, the one from the beginning, Chicago, April 30th, 2021, the 17-year-old boy with blood on his face and a broken understanding of who he is. The 3 seconds where the mind breaks while the body heals. That boy is still in the crater. In a very real psychological sense, part of Mark Grayson never left. Part of him is still lying in the rubble, looking up at the man he loved, trying to make sense of a world that just stopped making sense. The body flew away. The body healed. The body put on the costume and the name and went back to work. But the boy stayed. The boy is waiting. The boy is the part of Mark that has not been addressed, has not been processed, has not been integrated into the adult who walks around using the name Invincible as though it is an identity rather than a defense. A psychologist would say that Mark's work, the real work, the work that no amount of Viltrumite strength can do for him, is to go back to that crater. Not physically, psychologically, to return to the moment of breaking and to sit with the boy who broke and to tell him that the breaking was not his fault, that the trust he gave his father was not foolish, that the love he felt was real, even if the object of that love was not entirely what he believed. The work is to integrate the crater into the story of his life, not as the defining chapter, but as a chapter, one among many. Painful, informative, and real, but not the whole book. Mark has not done this work yet. The show has not let him. And the show's refusal to let him, its insistence on piling new traumas on top of old ones, on giving him no breathing room, no safe harbor, no period of sustained peace in which the psychological work could actually begin, is itself a statement about the nature of trauma in the real world. Most people who need help do not get the conditions that help requires. Most people who need to heal are too busy surviving to do the work of healing. Most people carry their craters with them, invisible and unprocessed, through years and decades of a life that keeps demanding more from them than they have to give. Mark Grayson is one of those people. He happens to have superpowers. He happens to be able to fly and punch and survive things that would kill anyone else. But none of those powers reach the place where the damage lives. None of them touch the crater. None of them heal the boy. And the gap between what Mark can do and what Mark needs is the gap that makes his story underneath the spectacle one of the most honest portraits of psychological trauma in modern fiction. Not because it gets the punching right, because it gets the silence right. The silence that follows the punching. The silence in the room when the fighting is over and the body is healed, and the mind is still broken and the boy is still in the crater, and the world is asking you to stand up and be invincible one more time. If you enjoyed this, subscribing genuinely helps more than you might think. Thank you for staying. Sleep well. See you in the next one.